previous episode of this Airbrush Basics series, you learned how to mix your lacquer paints. And now it's finally time to learn how to use your airbrush. NewType is a fast and reliable source of Gunpla paints and tools shipped internationally. Purchasing with my affiliate link newtype.us/frostysnow also helps support me with a small commission. Before we start, understand that there are different styles and preferences to painting with an airbrush. I'm just showing you the way I do it, including my techniques, paint consistency, compressor PSI, and numerous factors that contribute to my final paint job. Everything is a balance between each other. There's no right or wrong. These are some of the kits I have painted. If you like what you see, take away what works for you and tweak it for yourself. First, let's look at what we're aiming for. What I aim for in a good paint job is evenness and smoothness. An even paint job means the color is applied equally on your part, without unintentional light or dark areas, a lack of or over coverage, or pooling, which is when paint collects in one area because you were heavy-handed with the paint. We're looking for an even color distribution. Smooth means the surface is smooth both to the eyes and touch, without rough spots, specks, dust, or something termed an orange peel finish. That is, it's bumpy like the peel of an orange. Obviously, these goals are for a clean paint job and can be relaxed if you're doing a weathered look. So how do we achieve this smooth and even finish? While there are so many factors that contribute to this, I've broken it down into two main categories. 1, control of your airbrush. 2, consideration of your parts. Let's look at what to control first. Number 1 is your trigger. The further back you pull, the more paint that comes out. This means controlling the amount of paint. Here is the trigger. When you just push it down, only air comes out. When you push it down and pull, the further back you pull, the more paint that comes out. My airbrush model also happens to have an adjustable screw that locks the trigger in place. See? It only goes halfway now. This helps you always maintain the same amount of paint coming out from your airbrush. I consider this more as training wheels and never used it myself, even as a beginner. Number 2 is the air pressure, which is set on your compressor as PSI, but the amount of air released is also controllable on your airbrush. If you release too much air with your paint will disperse more and hit your part too dry. If you use too little air, your paint will kind of drizzle out of your airbrush and go on blotchy like droplets. The right amount of air pressure will give you a smooth finish. Here is the air control valve. The tighter it is, the less air that comes out. The looser, the more air. You will realize you are using too much air with your paint if you get a lot of overspray or dots around your paint, or feel like you're holding the airbrush unnecessarily far back to make up for the large amount of air. If you hold it too close with too much air pressure, it will also pool. On the other hand, if you are not using enough air, you may make up for the lack of momentum by holding your airbrush very close to the part, feel like it takes a long time to cover an entire part, and get a spotty paint finish. The right amount of paint and air pressure combination will give you adequate coverage, smoothness, and little overspray. Number 3 is timing. If you hold your airbrush over a part for too long while painting, it'll be too dark, give uneven coverage, pool, or drip. If you go over the part too fast, the paint will be too light, lack coverage, or come out too dry. The right timing will give you an even and smooth finish. When you give too much time for your paint to hit the part, your paint will come out thick, pool, or worst of all, drip. If you don't allow enough time for the paint to hit the part, you won't get enough coverage. The right timing and therefore amount of paint over a part will give you even and smooth coverage. Number 4 is distance. If your airbrush is too close to the part, the paint will rebound, pool, or drip. Dripping is really the worst case scenario. It means you've really overdone it. If your airbrush is too far away, your paint won't reach the part, the paint will be too dry or tacky, lack coverage, and this is just a waste of paint. The right distance between your airbrush and the part will give you, again, a smooth and even finish. Too close, too far, about just right. Now, this obviously depends on the size of your part and a few other factors, but if your airbrush is too close to the part, you'll get pooling, dripping, or even splatter. Kind of cool effect though, huh? If your airbrush is too far, you'll get a tacky coat, hardly any coverage, and mostly waste your paint. At the right distance, you'll get the coverage and smoothness that you need without dripping or overspray. Number 5 is the starting point. If you start painting from the inside corner of the part, you may have empty light patches in the corner and a dark patch where you might have held your airbrush too long before moving it. Also, if you spray the line of paint side by side, you may have a gap in between your paint. It's also really common for beginners to not want to let go of their trigger and keep holding it down even while rotating a part or changing sides, which will just waste your paint. Ideally, you should start outside of the part, stop when you get to the end, position with a 50% overlap over your last line of paint, paint your way up, and stop outside of the part, never inside. Notice this is just how I paint, up and down and line by line. Some people paint in only one direction, zigzag, or patches. Note that everything is a balance between each other and can change according to the brand and type of paint, thinner ratio, and a variety of other factors. Now let's imagine this is your part. A lot of people start spraying from here, but when you start your airbrush, it takes some time for it to go to the full blast. It's already started to come out with a little bit of paint, so by the time you get to the full blast, and then you go down, and it's going to be a little bit more uneven up here. There's a little bit of the part here that hasn't been painted, because your starting point was here. So imagine that this is our part. What you should do is set your starting point outside of your part. I've completely covered even the edge of my part a lot more evenly and with the same amount of paint as would be in the rest of the part. Pick up at around this point again. I've made an overlap about 50% of the way in to my original first line of paint. I stopped my airbrush outside of the part. Now, the big question is always going to be, how do I know how far back to pull my trigger, how much air, timing, and distance I should use? You're gonna hate this answer, but you just have to find the sweet spot, adjusting all the factors I showed you. There's no exact mathematical formula because it can change if your paint is too thin, metallic, gloss, depending on the size of your part, whether you're painting lacquer, enamel, or acrylic, and just so many things. What I recommend is you paint as many scrap pieces of plastic or spoons that it takes until you get a relatively smooth and even finish, before moving on to an actual model. Now that we've gone over how to control your airbrush, let's take a look at some actual parts. While I am demonstrating with Gunpla, you can apply to whatever you're painting. The way you paint should be adjusted to the size, structure, and shape of your parts. For example, when you paint smaller parts, you need to use less paint, air, time, and distance to the part. For larger parts, you need to increase all of that. Remember, I recommend using a 0.3 airbrush needle for Gunpla. So far, we've been painting all flat parts. But what you paint will come in all shapes and forms. You need to decide, number one, will you paint the underside of the part? If it will show like the shield, then definitely yes. However, if it's a part with pegs, the more paint that goes on it, the thicker and harder it'll be to fit. Number 2, consider the narrow or blocked off areas where paint won't hit as easily, and make sure you hit it from a variety of angles to get an even coverage. And number 3, what order are you going to paint all this in? Finally, while the shape of the part doesn't necessarily affect the way you paint it, I want to point out that round parts are going to come out naturally a bit smoother, even if you paint it in the same way as a flat part. When the paint hits the part, the round surface allows the paint to bounce off easily and avoid any overspray or a tacky light coat around it. Whereas on a flat part, a lot of the rebound paint just gets back on the part, which causes a slightly bumpier texture. Why I mention it is so you have realistic expectations, and don't be too disappointed if your paint job on a flat kit doesn't look as good as you'd like. Considering all these factors, it means that a large, detailed flat kit is going to be more challenging to paint and get good results than a small, less detailed, rounded kit. That's why if you can overcome being overly ambitious, which most beginners are, and not find it beneath you to paint a petite bear guy as your first kit, you're going to learn so much more from it in a short amount of time. If you start off with a new Gundam Verka, you can easily burn out, mess it up, and you really don't learn that much more because there's limits to what you can do for the first time. Let's finally get to painting some actual parts. Notice I didn't sand away the nub marks. It's a common misconception that paint will cover up nubs, scratches, and imperfections. While Surfacer can cover light scratches to some extent, no amount of paint will cover up nubs and bumpy surfaces. Additionally, all of these parts are from my Mechanicore Ziegler kit and have a rougher surface than Bandai kits. I'd like you to compare it to the spoon I paint at the end and notice the difference between the surfaces. We'll come back to this. Before painting, I usually run some thinner through the airbrush to make sure it's not clogged or spitting and adjust the air valve as appropriate. While I'm using a gloss black for filming purposes, I actually recommend you practice with any gray surfacer. Its matte lays on pretty easily and is going to be the first thing you paint on an actual part. I pour it straight into the color cup, run it through a bit, blow off any dust with just air, and start painting the sides of my part. For a part like this, I wouldn't paint the underside because I don't think it's going to show. Especially for smaller parts, I usually start with a tacky or light dry coat because with less surface area, it's easy for paint to pool. I go right to the second layer without waiting. My coats are light and I don't feel a need to wait. If I plan to paint a metallic and top coat afterwards, I could stop here. If I'm going for plain black, I can do one more coat. Here is my third coat. All my coats are light on these small parts. On this very detailed pegged part, I'm going to skip the bottom, paint the sides, angles, then the top. Notice angles exist even on the sides of this part, so I will turn and angle my part as I paint. I'm starting again with a tacky coat, which may be a bit more heavy-handed than how other people do tacky, but it's definitely not a wet, glossy coat. I now paint the top, up and down, then left and right from other angles. Notice that even though I've technically laid 2 coats on the top, there are still nooks and crannies where the paint didn't reach. I spot paint any deep nooks and repeat the up and down, left and right, painting from the other angles. Notice that for the second layer, because I've already covered the entire part black, I can be less meticulous and paint a wet coat more straightforwardly. I'm not really turning it around as much or spot painting to hit certain angles. While watching my entire painting demonstration, keep the trigger, air, timing, distance, and starting points we discussed in mind. I try to keep all of that the same for each layer of paint. Now for our relatively larger, plain, round part. This is going to be easier to paint. Notice that I stop my airbrush when I change sides. A lot of beginners are reluctant to let go of their trigger, but that's just a waste of paint. Do practice letting go and getting the trigger back to where you were. I move my airbrush quite fast for the first tacky coat. Here's our second coat. As I start my wet coat, I notice the paint seems kind of thick and rough. It means my air is too low for this large piece. This needs to be adjusted every time you paint different sized parts. Remember, less paint and air for smaller parts, more for larger. That's why it's usually easier when you paint in large batches to organize them not only by runner but also by size. I usually start with the smaller pieces first as a warm-up. For beginners, if you start from large pieces, then transition to small pieces, it's easy to accidentally blast paint at it because you're used to the high settings. Notice that when I paint wet coats, my timing is a lot slower than tacky coats to make sure I get enough coverage and a proper gloss finish. Just for demonstration, I'm going to do this one in one single wet coat. Because there is no tacky coat underneath, I feel a need to hold my airbrush longer over the part and therefore already see some pooling. A tacky coat provides a rougher surface on your smooth part for paint to adhere to. As a rule of thumb, it's generally better to paint in multiple thin layers than single thick layers. I see some pooling on the edge at the top and bottom. If this happens here and there while you paint, it's actually not a huge deal once it dries. However, if every layer of paint pools, especially with clear color paints, it gets noticeable. Because a lot of people practice with spoons, let's do one too. When I taught my friend how to airbrush, after showing her how to use it, I threw her a bunch of plastic and told her to keep painting until it came out smooth and even first before moving on to a kit. Many people ask how long I wait between painting layers. You'll notice that throughout this whole video, I didn't wait at all. You can even touch it after 5 minutes, but definitely should wait overnight for assembly. Usually when painting a whole MG kit, by the time you finished painting a whole batch, say in 30 minutes, the first piece from that batch is ready for the next paint. I pour any leftover paint back in the jar and wipe off any excess. With the leftover, I show you what a really light tacky coat can look like. Mine is on the thicker side, like this one. Let's look at the parts after they dried. Notice none of these parts are as smooth and reflective as my spoon, which began with a super smooth finish. That's why you can't skimp out on at least sanding off num marks, and surface prep is as important as painting techniques. We will cover a bit of that as well as we move on in this series. Alright, if that was all really confusing, it's totally understandable. But once you've had enough practice, you'll be able to pick up parts and start painting, doing all of these things unconsciously. So what's next? In episode 4 of this Airbrush Basics series, I'm going to show you how to clean your airbrush when you change paints, after painting, spot clean for specific problems, deep clean for maintenance, including how to use a sonic cleaner. See you there. Oh, where's Cookie? Oh, there he is. We're gonna have hamburger today. I'd like to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to spend more time to build, paint, and produce videos while not having to worry about making a living at the same time. Patreon is a way for anyone to support their favorite creator and content. You can also join us on Discord to chat with me and fellow Gunpla hobbyists. Check it out at patreon.com/frostysnow. Thanks for watching!